Mordechai Vanunu. This really shouldn't be taped this year, but okay.
Should be taped. I actually read it.
The good one.
Mordechai Vanunu has been in the news recently, and Mordechai Vanunu has been calling for Israel to let him leave. Why is he asking Israel to let him leave? Well, who's Mordechai Vanunu? So if you Wikipedia, even though they always say not to trust things you read on Wikipedia, but for this case, Wikipedia, I'm just going to read a little bit. Wikipedia, Mordechai Vanunu was born in 1954, also known as John Crossman. He was a nuclear technician who worked in Dimona, and citing his opposition to weapons of mass destruction, he began to reveal details of Israel's nuclear weapons program in 1986. And our purpose is, what happened is that in 1986, after he had sold the story, I'm just looking here, there's like 20 pages on Wikipedia, it's very interesting to read. But I hope you didn't just get caught on camera wearing that.
Yes, he did.
At least they'll have a little bit of an understanding what I'm dealing with here. You ain't seen nothing yet at the BAYT, okay? So, it was back and forth, etc. Fine. Supposedly he actually renounced, whatever it means. He renounced his Yiddishkeit at some point before that. And even though you can't really do that, but he went to Bnei Akiva Yeshiva High School. He went through the IDF, etc. And in the early 1980s, he converted, whatever that means, to Christianity. Between 1976 and 1985, he was at the Negev Nuclear Research Center in Dimona, south of Dimona, and he would research, develop, and manufacture nuclear weapons. Obviously, none of this was public. And again, in the beginning of in early September 1986. So he flew to London in violation of his non-disclosure agreement, and he met with the Sunday Times, and he basically gave them a lot of information. They didn't want him to appear in public before they published the story, which was published on October 5th, 1986. And before then, he was somehow, without anybody knowing, he was captured the week before it was published. How exactly he was captured is a discussion for this evening. What they wanted to do is they didn't want to capture him on British soil because they had a good relationship with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and they didn't want any confrontations with the British intelligence, and therefore they had to figure out how to get him to leave the UK. How do you get him to leave the UK? So that's where Cindy came in. So Cindy, you're familiar with the story a little bit? It's fascinating. You're not familiar with the story? You know Cindy?
I read it this afternoon.
Oh, you read it this afternoon. Okay. He doesn't know Cindy. So Cindy...
The rabbi knows Cindy?
I do not know Cindy. She's way before my time. Cindy's name is Cheryl Ben Tov. She was born in 1960. And she's currently supposedly lives in Orlando. She's an American real estate agent. So she became well known in 1986 when, under the name Cindy, she actually went to London. She got Mordechai Vanunu to come to Rome, where if you read the story, you watch any of the movies, I think it's quite fascinating. Where she brought him in Rome to a small apartment in the old court of the city. There were Mossad operatives waiting there. They gave him paralyzing drugs. They had to sneak him out and put him onto a ship. He was brought back to Israel, where he was sentenced to 18 years in jail. He spent 11 of those years in solitary confinement, which is quite fascinating. Obviously, they're still worried to this day that he's going to reveal some information. He was released in 2004, and he's restricted with his speech, his movement. He's been thrown in jail numerous times because he's met with various people. Actually, he just got married 2 months ago. He got married. He lives in the church, I believe. He lives in the church in Jerusalem, in one of the churches in Jerusalem. It's the name of the church. I have it here in the article. He lives in a church in Jerusalem, and so he was in the news last week because he wants to leave now to visit Norway, I believe, which is where his wife that he just married is from, and they're not letting him leave again. He's supposed to be up in September. At some point, they're supposed to have another hearing in the Israeli Supreme Court to let him leave. That's the story of Mordechai Vanunu. What's interesting is that Cheryl Bentov, otherwise known as Cheryl Hannon, was Cindy. So she was born in America. She grew up in Pennsylvania and in Orlando. And she spent a semester in high school studying in Israel. She joined the Israeli army. She got married, which is very important for our discussion today. She got married in 1985, right before this. And then in 1986, she was recruited and she was trained by the Mossad. And she was the one who, again, helped abduct Mordechai Vanunu. So that's the story of Mordechai Vanunu. There's another story, which may or may not be well known. It's, again, fascinating just to do a little bit more reading on Mordechai Vanunu and on Cindy Sherrill. There's another lady named Shula Cohen. Anybody hear of Shula Cohen? If you know somebody named Shula Cohen, it's probably not her. Shula Cohen was born in 1920 in Argentina. She immigrated to Palestine in 1937. She got married soon thereafter, and again, she began working for the Mossad. Money was, they say, probably one of her motives. Before she started working, she was training in Tel Aviv, etc., etc. She was sent to London to learn English and to learn, quote-unquote, good manners and how to fish for men in troubled water, or how to fish for fish in troubled water. And she began working in Beirut in 1947. She sold sexual favors to hundreds of high government officials in Lebanon between 1947 and 1961 for 14 years. She helped bring Jews from Lebanon and other Arab countries to Israel. Through Lebanon, in 1950, she stole some of the security protocol between Syria and Lebanon, which they said definitely helped with the different wars that Israel had. And she was working for the Mossad the entire time. They provided her with all the equipment and all the cameras, etc. She was actually caught in 1961. She was caught after 14 years of spying, and she was sentenced to death. They then changed it to 20 years in jail, and in 1967, 6 years later, she was released in a secret prisoner exchange after the Six-Day War. You'll never believe where she lives. I don't know if she's still alive, but last I checked, she's still alive. You'll never believe where she lives. She actually lives in Mea Shearim, where they probably have no idea about anything of her past. So those are the, what?
Or maybe they do.
Or maybe they do. Probably not. So those are the histories, again, just in a very quick nutshell. I was actually surprised. I thought more people would have heard of them. Those are the histories of Cheryl Bentov Cindy, and the history of Shula Cohen, and the history, again, of Mordechai Vanunu. And there are some others. Again, there's another discussion we could have about Eli Cohen. There's another, Eli Cohen is the famous Israeli spy. That's a separate discussion. But what I want to do tonight, and we're not going to have time to discuss all of it, but I want to start the discussion. And thank you, Robert, for asking me, not last minute, but for asking me to give the shir, even though there wasn't supposed to be a shir tonight. So we quickly threw something together. Again, it's the beginning of a discussion. But what I want to discuss tonight is really this idea of Cindy. I want to discuss whether what they did, whether what Cindy did, whether what Shula Cohen did, whether this was halachically permissible. After all, they were Mossad agents, very nice, but they are Jewish, and both of them were married. And the question becomes, is that a legitimate halachic thing to do, to act as a honey trap? If you Google honey trap, so honey trap is known, the honey trap definition of honey trap is this idea of using somebody to lure other people, to lure an enemy into the hands. And if you do so that's officially what a honey trap is. I left my Tanakh in the office. Is there a Tanakh here?
We're in this shul?
Is there an art book?
Let's go to the church.
Here, this is the key to the office. Okay, yeah. First office.
This is the office.
That's my office, which is the first office on the right.
First office in there. No alarm that's going to go off?
No alarm, definitely no alarm. Okay, so the question is, are you allowed to engage in, to initiate and engage in illicit relations in certain cases when it's clear that that method is the quickest and most effective way of acquiring essential information about the enemy or stopping an attack that threatens the safety of our people? Obviously, just to engage in illicit relations for no reason would be usher. The question is, in these cases where, again, seemingly there was some type of important information that was going to be gathered, would it be mutter? Now, I don't want to concentrate on these specific cases and say the metzius. I don't want to talk about metzius of these specific cases and argue whether or not Mordechai Vanunu had information that we would consider to be extremely extremely dangerous or not, and how important it was, and how much he would have shared. Because again, the article was published in the Times. You can see a copy of the article. But at the end of the day, it's hard to know exactly, and Israel still feels obviously that there's some information that he has seemingly. So it's hard to know exactly what information he has and how important it was to capture him. So I don't want to talk about the Metzias and argue that what Cindy did was wrong, because at the end of the day, the information he had was not that important. We don't know for sure. Clearly, the Mossad felt that the information, even though the Mossad might have not been run by the halachic decision of Cindy, but at the end of the day, we cannot argue or actually know what information he did or didn't have. And until this day, we don't in fact know all the information that he did and didn't have. And again, we could say the same thing about Shula Cohen, even though by Shula Cohen's case it seems pretty clear, it seems pretty clear that she had quite important information from the higher Lebanese and Syrian government, which was very beneficial to Israel. But again, I don't want to argue on the Metzias about whether we needed that information or not. You could even argue that these are all cases of Safek Pikuach Nefesh, that even if it's not Pikuach Nefesh, it's Safek Pikuach Nefesh, which would be, obviously make the discussion a lot more serious. But it is pretty clear from Mordechai Vanunu, at least, that Israel was already developing nuclear weapons many, many years ago. There is much discussion as to why they're so hesitant to let him speak, besides for the fact that he might not have any secrets anymore. He might, but he might not. But of course, there's a whole discussion when it comes to the allies in the United States. And, officially, if you are producing nuclear weapons, you're not supposed to get any help from the United States. And they're worried about the $2 billion that Israel gets every year from the United States. And if all of a sudden they came out and it was clear, because Israel has officially not acknowledged the fact that they have nuclear weapons. So if it's clear from Vanunu, and if he continues to talk and it just comes clearer and clearer that they have nuclear weapons, so then you're causing the potential to have a lot of problems. But again, without talking about the Metzias, the question becomes, do we have any precedent in Tanakh for this type of discussion, of using illicit relations in extreme cases where it's clear that that's the most effective and quickest way in order to acquire essential information that's important to stop an attack, to prevent something that will threaten the safety of our nation, the Jewish people. Again, that's known as a honey trap. So what would the problem be is the question, obviously. So the problem would be the Gemara in Sanhedrin on Ayin Dal and Amud Aleph. And again, we're not going to be able to finish the discussion tonight, but at least we can start the discussion. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Bishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzadek. Kol averot shebatorim omin la'adam avor ve'al tarog, yavor ve'al yarog, chutz me'avoda zara ve'gilei arais v'shvichos damim. So avoda zara, Gilei Arayos and Shvichos Damim is the cases of Yareg v'al Yavor. Now again, that's a whole other discussion as to what exactly is the rationale of Yareg v'al Yavor. Why is it that there are certain dinim that we should say? If you think about it, we always take it for granted. Since the time we're growing up, these are Yareg v'al Yavor. Why is it Yareg v'al Yavor? So the Gemara talks about it a little bit, but at the end of the day, if you think about hashkafically, what is it about Avodah Zarah that makes it a Yareg v'al Yavor? Again, today we can't necessarily relate because we don't have the same cheshek for Avodah Zarah that they used to have. But at the end of the day, what is it about Avodah Zarah? What is it about Gilei Arayos? Maybe it would be the easiest one to understand why it shouldn't be Yareg v'al Yavor. The easiest one for me to understand why it is Yareg v'al Yavor is Shvichus Damim, as the Gemara says. The one that might be a little bit easier would be Avodah Zarah, because you're just going to basically cause everyone to just not believe in a Kadosh Baruch Hu eventually. The hardest one to understand would be Gilei Arayos. But then again, one can argue that Gilei Arayos, and obviously Midian and Moab and Ammon, they all saw this. Like Gilei Arayos is something that clearly can ruin the Jewish people as well. So it is understandable, but again, a much deeper halachic and hashkafic discussion. So Avodah Zarah, where do we see, and why would it be that Avodah Zarah would be an Isser that would be Yareg v'al Yavor? And again, there's a whole discussion as well as what happens if you're over an Isser of Yareg v'al Yavor. Right? We're supposed to go ahead and we're supposed to give up our life, and we're not supposed to be over the Avera. If you are, in fact, over the Avera, there's a whole discussion in the poskim whether you be chayav misa or not. So the Gemara says, Avodah Zarah, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, v'yahavta es Hashem Elokecha, b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha v'chol miyodecha. So in general, what's the reason that we have to not die? Because it says v'chai bahem and not die by him. So you need to v'chai bahem. You need to live with the mitzvos. So why by idol worship should you die? Because it says v'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha v'chol miyodecha. Now it doesn't specify which commandment you need to give up your leiv, your nefesh, and your miyodecha for. But seemingly idolatry is the absolute antithesis of loving God. V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha. You're loving Avodah Zarah, you're not loving God, and therefore it would seem even b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha v'chol miyodecha, even with your nefesh, with your soul, you'd have to give up this idea. You'd have to give up your life instead of serving Avodah Zarah. Fine. Shvichos Damim is the famous idea. It's a svarahu. It's not even based on a pasuk. Mi yemar didama didach sumak tvei dilma dama dehu gavra sumak tvei. Who said that your blood is redder than your friend's blood? What gives you a right to decide that your friend's going to die and you're more important to this world than your friend? And the final thing is ushvichos damim, illicit relation. And the final one is gilei rayos. Makish nara miurasa, which we've been talking about a lot in the Daf Yomi. The nara miurasa, the nara who's engaged. But again, back then engagement wasn't like it is now. It's not that you just engage. Back then when you're engaged, so you actually need to get a get. And if you're over the Esther of nara miurasa, if you have illicit relations, so then you'd be chayiv misa, and so would the man. So makish nara miurasa l'rotzeach. There's a hekesh to rotzeach. Ma rotzeach, just like we just said, shvichos dam is yarg v'yavor. Af nara miurasa tehareg v'al yavor. And again, in Svara, you could probably explain illicit relations as well, that it's definitely one of the foundations of keeping the Jewish people together. So that's the Gemara which speaks about the problem. So in our case, we're clearly dealing with a case of gilei arayos. We're dealing with a case of forbidden relations. Now, what exactly is illicit relations? So illicit relations are defined as the Torah as certain close relations. The most common illicit relation would be the relation of a married woman with another man. Again, a single woman, and this sometimes is thrown around as a heter, which clearly is not a heter, but a single woman, while definitely against halacha and definitely promiscuous, is not defined as an illicit relation. And therefore, there are those who argue if a single woman goes to the mikvah in certain circles, so then she goes to the mikvah, so then we obviously don't hold like that. It's usher. But in terms of gilei arayos, in terms of a illicit relation, so a single woman would not be an issue, but only a married woman would. Now, if a single woman was benida, so then seemingly it would be a problem. But if she's not benida and she goes to the mikvah, so then again it wouldn't be considered in our venue of gilei arayos. So to a man, obviously, is not over gilei arayos. A man, even if he's married, unless he has relations with one of the people that are specifically mentioned in the Torah: daughter, mother, sister, sister-in-law, mother-in-law, etc. So based on this Gemara, it would seem like a married woman, the gilei arayos, a married woman would have to be yareg val yavar. A married woman would have to die rather than commit adultery. It doesn't say anything about exceptions. It doesn't say anything for sure about something like the honey trap. And therefore, seemingly, based on this Gemara, just pashup pshat, it would be usher for a married woman to go ahead. Not that you could say maybe they should employ single women. Well, again, single woman is still not the best thing in the world. We don't just say single women can go ahead and be promiscuous or whatever they want. But clearly, based on this Gemara, if you're talking about sins that are yareg val yavor, gilei arayos, it would seem pretty clear from this Gemara that the Mossad for sure cannot employ married women for any of these activities under any circumstances. Again, Cindy was a married woman at the time, as was Shula Cohen. Fine. That's step number one. Step number two, which you might be able to think of without looking at the sheet, but if you have looked at the sheet, please don't say it out loud. But where do we have two precedents in Tanakh for married women who actually engaged in illicit relations, and didn't only engage in illicit relations, but seemingly engaged in illicit relations for circumstances that were similar to these circumstances? Who do we have? Esther and
Yael.
Excellent. Esther and Yael. So we have Esther. So Esther went ahead and she, again, seemingly went ahead and she engaged in illicit relations with Achashverosh. And so too, she was seemingly doing it for the good of the Jewish people. What do you think?
But she was single.
That's Halachic.
She married him. Who was she married to?
Parak Beis, Esther says, Nara, you should have come to the women's shir in Megillah Esther. You would have learned a lot.
I thought she was
Men were not invited. So the Esther Parak Beis says, look at the source sheet. V'hanara yifas Torah v'tovas mareh uvemos avia v'ima likacha Mordechai lo lebas. Lebas, some people say lebas, many people say lebayas. He took her as a wife. She was his niece, and she took her as a wife. Not so crazy. It sounds crazy today to take your niece, but even 50 years ago, in the time of the war, or even before then in Europe, so they definitely married relatives. Again, that's the way that they learned. You can argue. You could definitely argue that she was single. You could definitely argue that she was single. If she's single, so then we have no precedent that married women can go ahead and do this. But assuming that she's not single, then we have a discussion. So she's married to Mordechai. Then what happens? V'yes ma'amar Mordechai Esther osa. And it goes further than just Lebas versus Lebayas. V'yes ma'amar Mordechai Esther osa kasher haisa be'amna ito. When he was with her. What does it mean? So the Chazal tell us be'amna ito that when he was with her, what would she do? She was raised by him. That's a pashup pshat. The Chazal tell us what would she do? She would be with Achashverosh, and then she would go to the mikvah and she would be with Mordechai, who was her husband. So again, there's different interpretations. 100% there definitely are those who say that they weren't married, but there definitely are interpretations of Chazal that they were married. Okay, so let's assume that they were married.
Does the dimension or the fact that here we're dealing with Esther, we're dealing with the fact that Achashverosh was a goy, add another...
Interesting. So I was going to mention that later, that maybe the fact that he's a goy might be, and you could say that about the Lebanese and the Syrians as well. Mordechai Vanunu was definitely a Jew. You can argue that he unconverted, but there's no such thing. We don't believe that. Once a Jew, always a Jew. Sorry, but you're stuck. So at the end of the day, we see over here that most say that Esther was married based on the pasuk that we showed, and then the next pasuk seems to support it as well. Because what happens now? Again, she gets called to Achashverosh. Then Mordechai comes and says, "Okay, now it's time. This is when it's time to step up. This is why you've been chosen." So what does he say? So now she says to Mordechai, "But now I'm going to go without being called," and she's worried for her life. But not just that, she says, avadati. But what does it mean, asher lo kadas? So again, Chazal on asher lo kadas, when they say it's unlawful, so the pashup shot is that she's going without being called. But Chazal say that until now, it was asher lo kadas. It was ba'ones. When she was going, it was against her will. But now, if you're going with your will, basically he's not calling you. If you're going by choice, so now, all of a sudden, you're going to become usher to Mordechai. But what she's basically saying now, asher lo kadas, is that until now I wasn't called, that's a pashup shot, but until now I wasn't called, and therefore I'd still be mutter to my husband, because I didn't do anything wrong. But if I go now, then I'm going to be usher to my husband. And that could be what she's saying also, we're going to be lost, and I'm going to be lost from you as well, because she won't be able to return to her husband Mordechai after going to Achashverosh by choice. But again, you see over here that there is definitely an opinion, and a strong opinion in Chazal, that Esther was in fact married when she went to Achashverosh. She was clearly going to Achashverosh for a similar reason. Again, sounds like a much more extreme reason by the case of Achashverosh, where there was imminent danger to the Jewish people. And again, I don't want to talk about the Metzias. One can maybe argue that by Shula Cohen and by Cindy there was an imminent danger, but one can argue that there was imminent danger. Again, in retrospect, we don't know what he knows. We know what he shared, but there might have been a lot more that he could have shared about Israel's nuclear powers and nuclear weapons. So that's that case
really
as well.
It's really far-fetched to think that the Achashverosh, a king, would allow his wife to be violated by somebody else.
What do you mean?
He's in harem.
To think that she went back to Mordechai.
Yeah.
Well, she went. I mean, if she went, it wasn't something that she was publicly living with him. Again, she was in the. If anything, it was something that was done very, very privately. You have to remember. Again, we discussed this a lot in the Shir. Achashverosh this wasn't his one wife. Achashverosh had hundreds of women. She said that he didn't call her for 6 months. So it's not like he was keeping a tab on every single one. He had hundreds of women.
He's still king.
He was king, but again, when you have hundreds of different women and a new woman every night, so you're not necessarily, she may be the most beautiful, but clearly he felt at some point that he got over her, because even when she was the most beautiful, he hadn't called her for all of these months. That's what she was so worried about when she went into Achashverosh that time. He says, I haven't been called in all these months, how can I go up and just show up in the palace? And again, we developed this whole idea. So you're right, to an extent she was the queen, but to an extent she was only one of many, many things. There's actually recently, I think I saw on CNN, I was watching a little bit of a video. So they have this now, even if you go to like Africa, where they have these kings who have like, hundreds of wives, and they have like these whole palaces, and they all sleep in these separate, it looks like camp basically, and there's just hundreds of wives hanging out there. And then like, if you're the lucky one, you get to sit next to him in his funny outfit and everything. But okay, so that's that's a separate thing. But over here, that's one way to explain Achashverosh. The other case that we had is a case of Yael. So the case of Yael, which is in Shoftim Perek Dalet. So we know Bnei Israel is sinning, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends Canaan, who's led by the general Sisera, and he oppresses Bnei Israel for 20 years. Now, it's interesting, and you can mention here as well, I was actually thinking the other way. Here she was with Achashverosh, but in the case of Yael was actually married to Chever Hakeni. So one can argue that, maybe she wasn't Jewish. That's what some say that Yael wasn't Jewish. Most say that Yael actually was a convert, and she was a real Jew, and she was a convert like Yisro. But we know the story that happens. So what happens? So the Tanakh tells us that Sisera's army was wiped out, and then Sisera fled, and she came to the tent of Yael. Eshes Chaver the Kani, because there was peace between Yavin, the king of Chazor, and the house of Chaver, and she went to Sisera, and he said, do not fear. So she went into the tent, and she gave him a little bit of water, because he was thirsty. She gave him some milk, and then he said, stand at the entrance, and then she took a tent peg, placed a hammer in her hand, and, as we know, drove the peg into him, and she was killed. Now, the Gemara adds some details to the story. The Gemara in Nazir, on Daf Chav Gimel Amud Beis, tells us, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Gedola Mavera Lishma mi mitzvah shelo lishma. I don't have it on the sheet. But it's greater, a transgression for the sake of heaven is greater than a mitzvah performed shelo lishma. And then again, the Gemara says, Ela ema ke mitzvah shelo lishma, that is equal. But we see the greatness of an avera lishma, doing an avera for the sake of heaven. And it says, what's an example of an avera lishma? It's an example, and he gives an example of Yael. And he compares it to Sarah. But what does the Gemara say? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Sheva be'ilos bal osa rasha be'osa shah. Based on the psukim where it says, Bein ragleha kara nafal, etc., between her legs, and the next thing when it's praising her, the next chapter, which is the song of Devorah, the Shir of Devorah, which praises amongst other things, it praises Yael. So in that song, in pasuk number 27, it says, Bein raglea kara nafal shacha, bein raglea kara nafal, ba'asher kara sham nafal shadud. And it basically says 7 times between ragleha kara nafal, and therefore they learn that she actually was with him 7 times in order to weaken him, 7 acts of intercourse with Yael and with Sisera, and then finally she was able to kill him after the fact. So again, we see another precedent, that Yael was married, she seduced Sisera, she slept with him 7 times, and then she stabbed him to death. So you want to argue that she wasn't Jewish, maybe you could argue she wasn't Jewish. But seemingly most say that she was a Jew, she was a convert. And therefore, you seem to have 2 precedents in the Tanakh itself, where it's okay to initiate in illicit relations even a married woman, and surely a single woman in certain select and extreme cases, it's not a blanket heter, but in certain select and extreme cases, where it's clear that it's the quickest and most effective way of taking care about the enemy or stopping an attack that threatens the safety of our nation, of the Jewish people. That's the Gemara, and that's the Tanakh. You had a question?
I just thought she wasn't Jewish. You said, I thought she wasn't Jewish. I thought she was.
So we mentioned,
Yisro's family or something. He lived within the Jews. But
so according to many, she actually converted and she was a full-fledged Jew. Again, if you argue that she wasn't Jewish, then there's nothing to talk about. Then you have no precedent. If you argue that Esther wasn't married, then you have no precedent for that. But we're assuming that they were. Based on the Gemara and Sanhedrin, the question becomes, what was the heter for their actions? What was the heter for what Yael did? And what was the heter for what Esther did? And again, I just wanted to start the conversation. I want to show you a few different possibilities. And then, it's definitely worth thinking more about and maybe discussing once again. So heter number 1. Heter number 1 is based on the Shut Shvus Yaakov. Shut Shvus Yaakov was in the 1700s, and he was asked a very interesting question. Siyah shel b'nei adam shehalchu b'derech ve'echad mehem ishto imo. So there was a bunch of men, a bunch of people seemingly, and amongst them was a married man and woman. Umatzu sham anshe b'liah rutzchanim shehima muadim laharog nefashos al iske mamon. And they got basically hijacked by a bunch of robbers who wanted to kill them. So they realized the only way that they'd be able to save themselves is if this woman, this married woman who's part of the group, if she would go ahead and she would basically offer herself to the men who had come to steal all of their money. So that's what she did. So they survived. So now the Baal comes to the Shvus Yaakov and wants to know, is my wife mutter to me? Since I did it on myself, but it was mitzad ones, we had no choice because we would have been killed otherwise. Or do we say that it wasn't so? So do we say that it was ones, or do we have to say that for whatever reason we chose to do it, and therefore it would be usher for me to return to her? Because again, a wife who is raped, obviously you can return. It becomes very complicated in the case of a Kohen, but in a regular case, wife who is raped, as long as it's ba'ones, as long as it's against her will, so then it would be okay. If it's with her will, then you have much more of a problem. So the Gemara says, the Shut Shvus Yaakov says, interestingly, Av she'en kan nidnud avera she'asisa lahatsalas rabim. Very, very interesting. So he goes ahead and he says that when you're saving the rabim, so then it's okay. So he's the first one to draw a difference, well, not the first one, but for our purposes, the first one that we see to draw a difference between saving yourself and saving others. If it's a matter of saving yourself, so then the Gemara says, Yoreg Val Yavor. You can't go ahead and take part in illicit relations to save yourself because Gilei Arayos is Yoreg Val Yavor. When it comes to Gilei Arayos to save the Rabbim, so seemingly you can engage in illicit relations in order to save the Rabbim, and obviously even if you're part of the group, that will ultimately be saved. And that's why according to the Shishvat Yaakov, she was okay with what she did, because Lamaisa, she wasn't just saving herself, she was saving other people as well. How many? It doesn't seem to say. It would seem that in this story it's just a bunch of people, and you would see that as long as it's somebody else seemingly besides for yourself, again not clear how many people there were, but seemingly even a small group of people, if it's a matter of not just saving you but saving other people as well, so then it would be okay. Yeah. Obviously going back to Esther and to Yael, so what would you say?
Contradiction.
That what?
Because here if in the first part she said that she was, once she goes voluntarily, then she's also the Mordechai. But here they sent her voluntarily before they asked, and
but she
said that she was.
No. He has a good point. According to what we're saying here, according to the way that the Shus Yaakov is saying, is that she can even. It says Av she'ein kan nidnu avera she'asta latzalas rabim. It sounds like she didn't do anything wrong, and she could totally go back to her husband. It sounds like at least Esther thought at the time that she was going that she would then be usher to Mordechai by doing so.
I think I read this Tshuva once before. I don't think he let her go back to her husband.
He didn't?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think the Chabad Yard has a tshuva like this. I don't think he let it go back to.
I have the whole tshuva. I pulled part of it out. I didn't see that, so it's possible. It would make sense. It would make sense with what Robert is saying that she couldn't go back. But it's hard to say that she couldn't go back if you're telling me that there was af she'ein kan nidnu avera.
Nidnu avera she'asal still Rabbim. She still can't go back to her husband, even though.
Okay, I have to double check that. But at the end of the day, in terms of for our purposes, so the question whether she goes back to her husband now would just be a contradiction or not on Esther. But at the end of the day, for our purposes, we see that she was able to do what she did, and it wasn't Yareg Val Yavor. And therefore Esther and Yael were allowed to do what they did because, again, they were seemingly saving a bunch of people, probably a lot more than a bunch of people. And so, too, the Mossad, when they do what they do, they're not just doing it for any individual person, they're doing it for a bunch of people. And therefore, illicit relations, even when initiated by a married woman, would be okay. That's heter number one. Heter number two would, yeah.
So, in this discussion here, in the Gemara, Tosfos there discusses the issue of Esther, and comes up with the teretz of Karka Ola.
She's passive.
Right?
Right.
Right, but doesn't give the teretz of Hatzalah, right? So at the end, he also doesn't hold of this. And the question becomes, where does the Shus Yaakov get this from?
Right.
It's not from that Gemara, it's not from the Tosfos.
Right,
because Tosfos clearly was bothered by this and didn't give that answer.
Right, interesting. Okay, an interesting question. So again, just to sort of present some of the sources, but there definitely is more research to be done.
No, Tosfos just gives the answer Karka.
No, he says Karkolam for sure.
But in the end, he also gives a second option.
Correct. He discusses there in that Tosfos. He also discusses, but I think he at the end, I have to see it again, but he comes out that it was Karka Olam.
Okay.
But he does bring down the other one of Hatzalas Nefashos.
Okay. So Esther and see Tosfos there. Okay, good. So we're having a good conversation. Okay, so we have to check out the Tosfos and we have to double check the Shus Yaakov versus Esther. Okay, good. So people are paying attention. Next, heter number two. It's always good when you get good questions. Okay, you don't feel like you're talking to yourself. Well, that's the nice thing about always being taped. You always feel like even if nobody's listening in the room, somebody's eventually going to listen to you. The Maharik. So the Maharik says heter number two. V'hinei davar pashathu ki Esther lo asasa shum iser. V'lo haya b'davra afilu nidnu avera ela mitzvah rabba asasa shehitzila kol Yisrael. Now the Maharik is taking it a little bit further. The Maharik came earlier. The Maharik died in 1480 in Italy. So the Maharik was 250 years before the Shus Yaakov. But the Maharik seems to hold that you're allowed to engage in illicit relations, but not even lahatzalas rabim. It sounds like it can only be likol Yisrael. And it seems like he would argue with the Shus Yaakov, and seemingly he would say that you would still be over Gilei Arayos, and you can't be over Gilei Arayos even for a bunch of people, only if it's Shehitzila Kol Yisrael. Aderaba Pshita She'asa Mitzvah Rabamot. And once you're dealing with Kol Yisrael, obviously it's a big mitzvah. Very, very interesting. Again, it's very difficult to define in all of these cases what Hatzalas Rabbim is, what Kol Yisrael is, but definitely more than Rabbim. Kol Yisrael is definitely more than Rabbim, definitely than a small group or a bunch of Jews. But we can't, at the same token, learn that Kol Yisrael means all the Jews, because there were definitely other Jews in the world at the time of Esther and Yael that we can say that even if Esther didn't act, so then you can argue that maybe not all the Jews would have been killed, even though one can argue that, in fact, if it wasn't for Esther, then all of the Jews in the world would have been killed. That's the Maharik. So you have the Shvus Yaakov, which is Hatzalas Rabbim. You have the Maharik, which is Hitzila Kol Yisrael. Then you have the Noda B'Yehuda, who died in 1793. Noda B'Yehuda seemingly was a little bit after the Shvus Yaakov. So the Noda B'Yehuda says, Guf din zeh sheyehe mutter la'eshes ish liznos biratzon kedei lahatzil nefashos eina Torah. It's not Torah that a woman can go ahead and be mizaneh so that she could save nefashos. V'lo yashar be'enai ma she'araisi be'ezah tshuva. And I don't like what I saw in the tshuva. Which tshuva do you think he's referring to? Well, it could have been either one of them, but seemingly he's referring to the Shvus Yaakov. I don't like what I saw in the Shvus Yaakov. V'isha v'ish shavim v'tarareg v'al yavor. You have to go ahead and be tareg v'al yavor. V'Esther shani. Interesting that the Maharik talks about Yael, he talks about Esther. Shehaisa lahatzaz klal Yisrael mehodu v'yatshuk. Mehodush v'yad kush. So seemingly he's learning that it's a lot. It sounds like he's saying that it's even more than Kol Yisrael, unless he didn't see the Maharik's tshuva. But it sounds like he's learning definitely not Latzalas Rabbim again, but definitely similar to the Maharik, more than the Shvus Yaakov. But again, the Shvus Yaakov would say a small group of people. According to the Maharik, you need to have many people, maybe Kol Yisrael, and seemingly the Noda B'Yehuda as well would say you have to have a significant amount of people, Mehodu v'yad kush. Either way, Esther was definitely saving a large group of Jews. Yael was definitely saving a large group of Jews, and therefore it would be okay according to most. And one can argue, again, without knowing the exact metzius in these cases, which I know it's very hard to even know in any specific case, but one can argue that the Mossad are gathering information to save a large amount of Jews, if not all Jews, and therefore one can argue, based even on these shilas and shuvas, that it would be okay for the Mossad to employ even married women as part of this job of the honey traps.
Yael's a tougher case because the war's over. He's the only guy left. He's fleeing.
Right.
He's the only guy left. His army's wiped out, and if he gets away, what? He's going to come back and regroup?
It only takes one guy. You know, it's again, you can argue, but
like I got.
No, I'm saying it only takes one guy to go ahead and start it all over again.
No, but I'm saying it's a weaker argument. Esther's argument is huge because
I hear
the war was coming. The war was over.
By Esther, the discussion would be, depending on how you learn, because I think it's a machlokes, as to after the plot of Haman was uncovered, what happened with Esther? Did she stay married to Achashverosh or not?
Right.
Because then it's no longer...
Right. Right. You're not dealing with that much time. You have to remember, you're not dealing with the Megillah being that much time. Between the time of the thing and the time that Haman was actually killed was pretty quick.
Right, so the question is what happened afterwards.
And seemingly she lived happily ever after with Mordechai, but hard to know. Maybe seemingly the way we're saying is that she never went back to Mordechai again. Right. That would be the way that Rav Chazal would learn. So those are the two heterim that you have, or one heter we would say. That you have the heter of a lot of Jews, some Jews, etc., which is obviously a very strong heter. The Rav Kook, who we know died in 1935, he has a wild heter. Rav Kook says something a little bit wild. He doesn't argue, but he adds to that. He says the following. We'll say it outside for a second. He says that there's approximately, at least nowadays in 2015, I think there's approximately 14 million Jews in the world. There's approximately 6 million Jews in Israel, and there's approximately 8 million Jews in other places. I think approximately 6 of the 8 million are living in the United States of America, something like that in Canada, and the other 2 million are throughout the world, but probably diminishing very, very quickly. So, therefore, a threat to either nation, the United States, or to Israel, or many nations for that matter, but at least those two, would definitely be under the category of Hatzalas Rabbim, would be under the category of maybe Kol Yisrael, but probably even Klal Yisrael Mehodu V'yad Kush. But Rav Kook says something fascinating. He says, even if you don't want to say that it's okay to have Gilei Arayos to save a small group of Jews, even if you want to say that we're not going to be able to use Gilei Arayos to save a large group of Jews, even if you're going to say you can use Gilei Arayos to save all or even most of the Jews, Rav Kook says, Nimsa, on the bottom, the last source, Shekasher Kal HaYehudim Be'eretz Yisrael Matzoi B'Sakana, that when you're dealing with Jews in Israel, and it's very Rav Kook to say this, Hadavar Matir Aveira Yid Isra Arayos Afilu Imein Kalzem Haverova Am. even if you argue that there's only 6 million Jews in Israel and most of the other Jews are somewhere else in the world. Shehayishuv hayehudi be'eretz Yisrael einena nechsheves ki yechidim o ketzibur misuyam ela nechshav kekahal Yisrael. And what he seems to be saying is that when your Jews are living in the land of Israel, you can willingly engage in illicit relations to save the Jews in the land of Israel, no matter what the number, and seemingly no matter what it takes. And that's very, very interesting. The first thing that came to mind when I heard of this, what comes to mind? There's an inyan of Hallel, one of the halachas of Hallel that comes to mind when you hear about this. What do you hear? What's the halacha by Hallel? When do we say Hallel?
Only for the miracle happened in Israel.
Ah, beautiful. So one of the reasons given that we say Hallel on Hanukkah and not on Purim, even though there are other reasons given by Purim because we say the Megillah, etc. One of the reasons given that we say Hallel on Hanukkah and not on Purim is because, after all, Hanukkah took place in the land of Israel, and even though there were many Jews living in the diaspora that weren't affected directly by the miracle, Lamaisa, since it took place in the land of Israel, we're going to say the full Hallel on Hanukkah. And that seemingly, Rav Kook is alluding to this idea as well. That once you're dealing with Israel, all bets are off. You're dealing with Israel, even it sounds like, if according to him, in the extreme case where there were 10 Jews living in Israel, it wouldn't matter. And even if we couldn't do something unless there were 1 million Jews living in America or in Canada or anywhere else, as soon as you're dealing with Eretz Yisrael, the Jewish homeland, then all of a sudden you can do things that you wouldn't be able to do anywhere else in the world. And therefore we have a bunch of heterim that we've seen tonight for Esther, for Yael, for the Mossad. You can use illicit relations maybe to save even a small group of Jews. You can use it maybe to save a large group of Jews, or you can use it to save any Jew living in the land of Israel. Now, just an additional heter, and again, this is just the beginning of a discussion, even though we've discussed a lot. There's much more to, as we've brought up various questions, excellent questions, but there's much more to explore, and definitely an interesting topic to look further into. But there are many who hold that if a married Jewish woman has relations with a goy, so then that would not fall into the category of illicit relations, as it was brought out here, and it would be usher, but not the illicit relations. And if it's not one of the big three, so then for sure it would be okay for the cases. So again, that would help us maybe in the case of Esther, that would maybe help us in the case of Yael, but it wouldn't help us in the case of Vanunu, because again, just because Vanunu thinks that he converted doesn't mean that he's not a Jew anymore, and Cindy was clearly Jewish. And I believe also that something else that might be on our minds that I don't think is something that is really a circumstance that we can draw a difference between is, until now we've been speaking about current danger. We've been speaking about Yael, we've been speaking about Esther, but one can argue maybe that the Mossad, we're not dealing with current danger. I don't think that's a fair argument. I think that any time we're dealing with the Mossad and dealing with information that the Mossad is trying to gather, and especially nuclear information like this, I don't think one can argue that it's not current danger. I think one can say that even though it seemingly is future danger, it's not really future danger. Because first of all, it prevents future danger from coming, and second of all, any danger that's dealing with with Israel is seemingly current danger. Again, there's more of a discussion about the status to her husband, which maybe we can discuss next time as well. And also, there's a whole discussion about some other topics related to this as well. But I just wanted to give a little bit of a basis as to part of the discussion that's dealing with Cindy, that's dealing with Cheryl Bentov, that's dealing with Shula Cohen, and now you maybe understand a little bit more of the whole discussion that's going on with Mordechai Vanunu in the press. And please do a little more research and follow up with any questions. And again, maybe we'll have another share to follow up on some of these discussions.